In the quiet village of Ravenswood, where cobblestone streets wound through a labyrinth of aging buildings, there stood a peculiar shop on the corner of Bellows Lane. Its wooden sign, etched with the words Gideon's Timepieces, creaked as it swayed in the evening breeze. The shop had a reputation, part curiosity, part menace. Gideon Thorne, the clockmaker, was a man shrouded in mystery. Tall and gaunt, with silver-threaded hair and eyes the color of storm clouds, he rarely ventured out during the day. His work was impeccable, crafting clocks of breathtaking complexity, each with a personality of its own. But whispers followed Gideon, carried on the same winds that rustled his shop's sign. People claimed his clocks were cursed. The rumor began years ago when a merchant purchased one of Gideon's creations, a grand, gilded clock with a haunting chime. The merchant was found dead 2 weeks later, his body cold as stone beneath the clock's steady tick. It was said his heart stopped in perfect time with the clock's final stroke. Tonight, as darkness fell over Ravenswood, the shop's door swung open, the bell above it jangling softly. A stranger entered. The stranger was a woman, her face partially obscured by the hood of her velvet cloak. She moved with a quiet determination, her boots tapping softly against the wooden floor. Gideon, seated at his workbench, didn't look up. His hands moved with mechanical precision, adjusting the delicate gears of a pocket watch. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice low and steady. Gideon's hands paused. He set the watch down and turned, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "I don't take custom orders," he said, his voice as measured as his work. "You'll take mine," she replied, pulling back her hood to reveal a striking face framed by raven-black hair. Her green eyes gleamed with an intensity that matched Gideon's own. Something flickered across his face, a brief shadow of recognition. "What is it you want?" Then, she reached into her cloak and withdrew a small, ornate box. Placing it on the counter, she opened it to reveal a shard of cracked glass, glowing faintly in the dim light. "This belonged to my father," she said. "It was part of his clock, one of yours. I want you to rebuild it." Gideon stiffened, his jaw tightening. "I told you I don't—" "It's not a request," she interrupted. "You owe me this. You owe him this." For a long moment, silence hung between them. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the dozens of clocks that lined the walls. Finally, Gideon spoke. "Leave it here. I'll see what I can do." After the woman left, Gideon locked the door and drew the blinds. He stood in the dim glow of his workshop, staring at the shard of glass. His hands, so steady moments before, now trembled as he picked it up. The shard pulsed faintly, as though alive. It was no ordinary glass. It was infused with something darker, something unnatural. Gideon knew its origin well. He had forged it himself, decades ago, as part of a clock unlike any other. The Lament Chronometer, he called it. It had been his magnum opus, a clock designed not to mark the passage of time, but to bind it. To Gideon, it was a masterpiece. To those who knew its power, it was a death sentence. He had thought the clock lost, its pieces scattered. Yet here was a fragment, returned to him like a ghost from his past. Gideon worked through the night, the glow of the shard casting eerie shadows across his tools. His hands moved with a deftness born of obsession, reassembling the clock in his mind before translating it into reality. The workshop was a labyrinth of gears, pendulums, and coils. Clocks of all shapes and sizes adorned the walls, their ticking forming a dissonant symphony. But as Gideon worked, the ticking began to change. It grew slower, deeper, each tick reverberating through the room like a heartbeat. The air grew heavy, and a faint whispering sound crept through the workshop. Gideon paused, his chisel poised above the clock face. "Is someone there?" he called, his voice unsteady. The whispering stopped. Gideon shook his head and returned to his work, but unease gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the shard was watching him, its faint glow pulsing in time with his own heartbeat. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, Gideon was jolted awake by a sharp knock at the door. He had fallen asleep at his workbench, the shard clutched in his hand. Rubbing his eyes, he stumbled to the door and opened it. Standing there was a man he hadn't seen in years, Nicholas Crow, an antiquarian and former friend. Nicholas was pale, his eyes hollow. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Gideon said, forcing a smirk. "I might as well have," Nicholas replied, his voice trembling. "Gideon, we need to talk." Nicholas stepped inside, his gaze darting around the workshop. "You're making another one, aren't you?" "What are you talking about?" Gideon asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't play coy with me," Nicholas snapped. "I know you, Gideon, and I know what your clocks can do." Gideon's expression darkened. "I have no idea what you're insinuating." Nicholas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I saw the chronometer in the dreams. It's calling to me, to all of us who touched it." At that, Gideon froze. "You hear it too, don't you?" Nicholas pressed. "That damn ticking." That evening, after Nicholas left, Gideon sat alone in his workshop. The shard sat before him, its glow intensifying as the shadows lengthened. Suddenly, one of the clocks on the wall stopped ticking. Then another, and another. Gideon's breath hitched as the silence deepened. Then, a single clock began to chime, a slow, mournful tone that resonated through the room. Gideon turned toward the sound, his heart pounding. It was coming from the clock he had just begun to assemble. But that was impossible. It wasn't complete. The clock's hands moved on their own, spinning wildly before settling on midnight. And then the whispering began again, louder this time. "Time's up, Gideon," a voice hissed, low and venomous. The glow of the shard flared, casting the room in an eerie, blood-red light. Gideon Thorne sat frozen at his workbench, the blood-red glow of the shard illuminating the terror etched on his face. The mournful chime from the half-assembled clock lingered in the air, each tone resonating deep in his chest. "Who's there?" Gideon demanded, his voice shaking. The whispering continued, faint but insidious, like 100 voices murmuring secrets just beyond comprehension. The shadows in the room twisted unnaturally, their movements too deliberate to be a trick of the light. Suddenly, the glow from the shard dimmed, and the workshop fell into a deathly stillness. Then, one by one, the clocks on the walls began ticking again. But their rhythm was wrong, erratic, as though they were mocking the passage of time. Gideon leaned forward, his trembling fingers brushing against the shard. The coldness of the glass stung his skin, and he recoiled as if burned. "You've opened a door you shouldn't have," a voice rasped. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a clear, guttural sound emanating from behind him. Gideon whirled around, but the workshop was empty. The next day, Gideon found himself pacing his workshop, his mind a whirl of unease. The shard sat on his workbench, covered now by a thick cloth, though its faint glow still seeped through. Nicholas had returned that afternoon, his face paler than the day before. He slammed the door behind him and grabbed Gideon by the shoulders. "You need to destroy it," Nicholas said, his voice trembling with desperation. "Destroy what?" Gideon replied, though he knew exactly what Nicholas meant. "The shard. The clock. Whatever you're building, Gideon, it's not just a machine. It's a curse, a trap, conduit." Gideon pulled away, frowning. "You're speaking nonsense." Nicholas leaned closer, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Gideon's. "Do you think I don't remember? We all do. The chronometer didn't just measure time. It stole it, fed on it. Do you think its victims were random?" Gideon turned away, refusing to meet his friend's gaze. "I didn't design it for that," he muttered. "But that's what it became," Nicholas snapped. "And now it's calling us back. Whatever you're building, Gideon, it's part of that thing. You can't finish it." "I don't have a choice," Gideon said quietly. "You do," Nicholas countered. "But you won't take it. And when it's too late, don't say I didn't warn you." That night, Gideon was alone in the workshop again. The shard lay uncovered, its faint glow pulsing in rhythm with the ticks of the clocks around him. He sat at his workbench, tools in hand, staring at the half-finished clock. Despite Nicholas's warnings, he felt compelled to finish it. Every time he tried to stop, an invisible force pulled him back, his hands moving as if guided by unseen strings. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the workshop grew oppressive. The air felt heavy, and the faint scent of burning wood lingered. Then came the sound, a soft creak, like a floorboard bending under weight. Gideon froze, his chisel hovering above the clock face. Slowly, he turned toward the source of the sound. A figure stood in the doorway, shrouded in shadow. Its outline was vaguely human, but its proportions were wrong. Its limbs too long, its posture unnatural. "Who's there?" Gideon called, his voice cracking. The figure didn't move. Summoning his courage, Gideon grabbed the lantern from his desk and held it aloft. The light spilled into the shadows, but the figure vanished as if it had never been there. Gideon's heart pounded in his chest. He set the lantern down and rubbed his eyes, convincing himself it was a trick of exhaustion. But as he turned back to his workbench, he froze. The shard was no longer glowing faintly. It was blazing, its crimson light casting sinister shapes onto the walls. And the clock, though unfinished, had started ticking. The following day, Gideon locked his workshop and ventured into the village. He needed answers, and he knew where to start. The town archives were housed in a crumbling brick building near the square. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of aging paper. "Looking for something specific?" asked Agnes, the elderly archivist who presided over the building like a stern librarian. "Records on my clocks," Gideon said, trying to sound casual. Agnes gave him a sharp look. "Your clocks, Bit of an odd request, don't you think?" "Just indulging my curiosity," he said. Agnes didn't look convinced, but she led him to a section of the archives filled with records of local businesses and notable events. As Gideon sifted through the documents, a chill crept over him. There were articles, letters, and testimonies, all detailing strange deaths and disappearances connected to his clocks. One particular entry caught his eye. A letter from a man named Elias Black, dated nearly 30 years ago. It described a dream, a vivid nightmare of being trapped in a labyrinth of ticking gears. When Elias awoke, he found himself paralyzed, his body cold and lifeless except for his beating heart, which matched the rhythm of his clock. Elias died days later, his clock stopping at the precise moment of his last breath. Gideon's hands trembled as he set the papers down. When Gideon returned to the workshop that evening, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The shard's glow seemed brighter than before, its light almost alive. He approached the workbench cautiously, his every instinct screaming at him to stop. But as he reached for the clock, a strange sensation washed over him. A low hum filled the room, growing louder with each passing second. The unfinished clock began to shake, its gears spinning wildly. Gideon stumbled back as a voice filled the workshop, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to echo from the very walls. "Finish it," the voice commanded. Gideon shook his head, backing away. "No, I won't." "Finish it, Gideon," the voice repeated, louder this time. The shard flared brightly, blinding him. When the light subsided, Gideon found himself frozen in place. His hands moved on their own, reaching for the tools on his workbench. "No," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I won't do this." But his hands betrayed him, assembling the clock with impossible speed. The gears clicked into place, the pendulum swung, and the hands of the clock began to turn. As the final piece was set, the clock emitted a deafening chime, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very foundation of the workshop. And then the whispering returned, louder than ever. The deafening chime of the clock lingered in the air, an unnatural sound that seemed to stretch time itself. Gideon stumbled backward, clutching his ears as the reverberations rattled every clock on the walls. The room felt alive, the shadows pulsing in rhythm with the clock's relentless ticking. When the chime finally subsided, the silence that followed was even more horrifying. It was as though the workshop had been swallowed by a void, leaving Gideon in a soundless abyss. But then, a new noise emerged, a soft, steady tapping, like fingernails drumming on wood. Gideon turned toward the source. The shard glowed brighter than ever, its crimson light now spilling into the clock's face. The tapping grew louder, and Gideon realized with dawning horror that it wasn't coming from the shard. It was coming from inside the clock. Terrified but unable to resist, Gideon approached the clock. Its surface shimmered as if coated in liquid glass, and when he peered into the face, he saw something that shouldn't have been there. A reflection stared back at him. Not his own, but a warped, grotesque version of himself. The figure's eyes burned with the same red glow as the shard, and its mouth twisted into a cruel, knowing smile. Gideon recoiled, but the reflection didn't move. It remained fixed, its fiery gaze following him. "You've done well, Clockmaker," the reflection hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "Who? What are you?" Gideon stammered. The reflection chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "A craftsman like you. But where you create machines, I create destinies. And now we are bound." Gideon shook his head, backing away. "I don't want any part of this. Take it back. Whatever it is, I don't want it." The reflection's smile widened, revealing jagged teeth. "It's far too late for that. You've built the clock, and now it will run its course." As the last word left the reflection's mouth, the room began to spin. Gideon fell to his knees, clutching his head as a cacophony of ticking, chiming, and whispering filled the air. When Gideon awoke, he was lying on the cold floor of his workshop. The clock sat silently on the workbench, its once vibrant glow now reduced to a faint flicker. He scrambled to his feet, his mind racing. Had it all been a hallucination? A fever dream brought on by exhaustion? A knock at the door shattered his thoughts. Gideon froze. It was the middle of the night, and he wasn't expecting anyone. The knock came again, louder this time. Reluctantly, he moved to the door and opened it a crack. A man stood on the threshold, his face pale and drawn. He wore a long coat, its hem damp from the rain, and carried a black satchel at his side. "Are you Gideon Thorne?" the man asked, his voice quiet but firm. "Yes," Gideon replied warily. "Who are you?" "My name is Dr. Malcolm Gray," the man said, stepping forward. "I need to speak with you about one of your clocks." Gideon hesitated but eventually stepped aside to let the man in. Dr. Gray placed his satchel on the workbench and withdrew a small, ornate clock. Its design was unmistakably Gideon's, though it was older, one of his earlier creations from years ago. The clock was cracked, its glass face splintered, and the hands were frozen at 11:59. "I bought this clock at an auction," Dr. Gray began, his tone grim. "I didn't know it was one of yours until I saw the signature engraved on the back." Gideon frowned. "So what? It's broken. Fixing it won't be easy." "But I don't want it fixed," Dr. Gray interrupted. "I want it gone." Gideon stared at him. "Gone? Why?" Dr. Gray hesitated, his eyes darting to the clock on the workbench. "Because it's cursed," he said finally. "Since the day I brought it home, strange things have been happening. Shadows moving when they shouldn't. Voices whispering in the dark. And last night I saw something." "What did you see?" Gideon asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Gray's hands trembled as he gestured to the broken clock. "It was a man, or something like one, standing in my bedroom. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his eyes, they burned red, like fire. And when I looked at the clock, the hands started spinning backward." Gideon felt a chill run down his spine. "You're sure it's this clock?" Dr. Gray nodded. "It's not just mine either. I did some research, and it seems I'm not the only one. There are others, people who've owned your clocks. Many of them are dead now, but those who are still alive, they all describe the same things. The shadows, the voices, the red eyes." Before Gideon could respond, the clock on the workbench began to chime. The sound was deep and resonant, far louder than it should have been for such a small device. Both men turned to stare at it, and Gideon's blood ran cold as he realized the hands of the clock were moving. "Did you wind it?" Dr. Gray asked, his voice trembling. "No," Gideon said, his eyes fixed on the clock. The hands spun faster and faster, blurring as they raced toward midnight. The shard embedded in the new clock began to glow once more, casting a sinister light across the room. "Get out," Gideon said suddenly. Dr. Gray hesitated. "What? Get out?" Gideon shouted, shoving the man toward the door. Dr. Gray didn't argue. He grabbed his satchel and fled, leaving Gideon alone with the cursed clock. As the door slammed shut, the clock's chimes stopped abruptly. The room fell silent, but the air was thick with tension. Then, slowly, the clock's hands stopped spinning and came to rest at midnight. Gideon approached the clock cautiously, his heart pounding. The shard's glow had dimmed, but the room still felt wrong, as if something unseen was watching him. He picked up the clock, intending to smash it, but as his fingers closed around its frame, a voice echoed in his mind. "Too late, Clockmaker," it said, cold and mocking. Gideon dropped the clock, stumbling backward. His eyes darted to the mirror hanging on the far wall, and his breath caught in his throat. A figure stood behind him, its form cloaked in shadows. Its eyes burned with the same red light as the shard, and its mouth twisted into a hideous grin. Gideon spun around, but the figure was gone. He turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, staring at him. "Finish the work," it said, its voice reverberating through the workshop. Gideon screamed, shattering the mirror with his fist. The shards rained down around him, and the figure vanished. But as the last shard hit the ground, the clock began to chime again, louder and more insistent than before. And this time, the shadows in the room began to move. The ticking of the clocks reached a fever pitch, creating an oppressive rhythm that seemed to vibrate within Gideon's skull. The shadows in the workshop thickened, pooling in corners and stretching unnaturally across the walls. He clutched his bleeding hand, watching as the broken mirror fragments shimmered on the floor. Reflected in them, the shadowed figure flickered like a distorted flame, its red eyes burning brighter with each chime of the cursed clock. "Finish the work," the voice echoed again, this time louder and more insistent. Gideon backed toward the door, his mind racing. The urge to flee was overwhelming, but something held him in place. It wasn't just fear, it was curiosity, a deep, unshakable need to understand what was happening. He forced himself to approach the glowing clock on the workbench. Every instinct screamed at him to destroy it, to end whatever nightmare he had inadvertently unleashed. But when he reached for it, the clock's glass face shimmered, and he saw something that froze him in place. A vision. The workshop around him blurred, its walls dissolving into a swirling mist. In its place appeared a grand, opulent room, lined with shelves of books and artifacts. Standing in the center was a man, tall, thin, and draped in a black coat that seemed to absorb the light. Gideon recognized him instantly. Elias Thorne, the original clockmaker and his great-grandfather. Elias stood over a workbench, meticulously assembling a clock. But this was no ordinary timepiece. The clock's core pulsed with an eerie red light, identical to the shard embedded in Gideon's creation. "Your work is nearly complete," a voice purred from the shadows. Elias didn't look up. "And what will become of me once it is?" A figure stepped forward, its features obscured by darkness. "You will ascend as promised. Power beyond your imagining. Immortality. The ability to bend time itself." Elias paused, his hands trembling. "And if I refuse?" The shadow laughed, a deep, bone-chilling sound. "There is no refusal. You accepted the shard. You bound yourself to the pact. You belong to me now." The vision shattered like glass, and Gideon found himself back in his own workshop, gasping for air. The clock on the workbench glowed brighter, its light pulsating in time with Gideon's racing heart. "This isn't just a clock," Gideon muttered, his voice trembling. It's a prison, a vessel for something." A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the workshop. "You're more perceptive than I expected, Gideon Thorne." The shadowed figure materialized in the corner of the room, its form shifting and flickering like smoke. Its eyes burned with malevolence, locking onto Gideon. "What do you want from me?" Gideon demanded, his voice cracking. The figure stepped closer, its presence sucking the warmth from the air. "You carry the blood of Elias Thorne, the first clockmaker. He made a pact, and his descendants have carried the burden ever since. Every clock you've built, every intricate gear and spring, it was all leading to this moment, Gideon shook his head. I didn't agree to any of this. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. Ignorance does not absolve you, boy. The work must be finished. The clock must be completed. A sudden knock at the door jolted Gideon from his terror. The shadowed figure vanished, leaving the room deathly silent. Gideon hesitated, his heart pounding. The knock came again, more insistent this time. He opened the door to find Dr. Malcolm Gray standing there, his face pale and drenched with rain. You have to let me in, Dr. Gray said, his voice shaking. They're after me. Who? Gideon asked, but Dr. Gray pushed past him, slamming the door shut. They know I came here, Dr. Gray whispered, clutching the broken clock in his hands. They want it back. Gideon stared at him, confused. What are you talking about? Dr. Gray set the clock on the workbench, his hands trembling. This clock, it's a tether, a doorway between our world and... There's the one you're building, it's the final piece. If you finish it, you'll open the door completely. As if in response to Dr. Gray's words, the clock on the workbench began to tick loudly. The shard glowed brighter, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Dr. Gray backed away, his face a mask of terror. It's waking up. You have to stop it. How? Gideon demanded, his voice rising. Dr. Gray pointed to the shard. That thing, it's the key. Destroy it, and the clocks will lose their power. Gideon hesitated, his gaze shifting between the shard and the shadowed corners of the room. The air grew heavy, and the oppressive presence of the unseen figure returned. You cannot destroy it, the voice boomed, shaking the walls. The shard is eternal. It binds the past, present, and future. Without it, time itself will unravel. Dr. Gray grabbed Gideon's arm. Don't listen to it. It's lying. The shard is its anchor to our world. Gideon felt paralyzed, torn between fear and desperation. He reached for a heavy hammer on the workbench, his hands trembling. Don't, the voice hissed, now laced with anger. Dr. Gray stepped forward. Do it, Gideon. Smash it before it's too late. The room seemed to hold its breath as Gideon raised the hammer. The shard pulsed, its crimson light intensifying, as if it were alive and aware of its impending doom. Gideon hesitated, the weight of the hammer heavy in his hands. The shadowed figure loomed larger, its form filling the room. You think you can defy me? It growled, its voice shaking the air. You are nothing without me. Without the shard, you are dust in the wind. Dr. Gray shouted, Don't listen to it. End this now. With a roar of determination, Gideon brought the hammer down. But just before it struck the shard, the light erupted in a blinding flash, engulfing the room in searing red. When the light faded, Gideon found himself standing in a vast, endless void. The workshop was gone, replaced by a landscape of swirling mist and shadow. The shard floated before him, untouched and glowing brighter than ever. The shadowed figure stood beside it, its eyes gleaming with triumph. You've crossed the threshold, Clockmaker, it said, its voice echoing in the emptiness. There's no turning back now. Gideon looked down at his hands, which were beginning to fade, as if dissolving into the mist. What's happening to me? He whispered. You are becoming part of the clock, the figure said with a cruel smile. Time demands its toll, and you will pay the price. As the void closed in around him, Gideon heard the relentless ticking of 1,000 clocks, each one marking the seconds of his doom. Gideon's body felt weightless, as though he were suspended in water. The misty void pressed around him, silent except for the omnipresent ticking. The sound wasn't just in his ears. It was inside him, beating in time with his own heart. The shadowed figure circled him, its glowing eyes narrowing. You are part of the machine now, Gideon. Each moment of hesitation, every tick of the clock, draws you closer to your fate. I didn't choose this, Gideon shouted, his voice echoing into the nothingness. The figure tilted its head, amused. Your blood chose for you. Elias's bargain set the wheel in motion, and now you carry the burden. Gideon looked down at his hands again. They shimmered faintly, like a reflection in a disturbed pool of water. The sensation was both foreign and intimate, as if he were unraveling, his very essence pulled into the relentless machinery of time. The mist shifted, revealing fragments of images, like shards of broken glass suspended in the air. In one, Elias Thorne worked feverishly on a clock, sweat beading on his brow. Behind him, the shadowed figure loomed, its hand resting possessively on Elias's shoulder. In another, Gideon saw himself as a child, sitting at his father's feet in the workshop. His father, stern but kind, showed him how to shape gears, each lesson tinged with an unspoken warning. Finally, a vision of his mother, her face pale and tear-streaked, whispering words he was too young to understand. "You must never complete the clock. Promise me, Gideon." The images vanished, leaving Gideon with a sinking feeling in his chest. "What was all of this for?" he demanded, turning to the figure. "Why my family? Why me?" The figure's laughter was low and menacing. "Time is the ultimate force, Gideon. It binds all things, dictates the rise and fall of empires, and seals the fates of men. Your family was chosen to create the vessel through which I would control it." With a flick of the figure's hand, the mist receded, and the familiar walls of the workshop emerged around Gideon. But the room was different now, distorted, as if viewed through a warped lens. The clocks on the walls ticked erratically, some spinning backward, others frozen in place. On the workbench sat the glowing clock, its crimson shard pulsating like a heartbeat. Dr. Gray was still there, slumped against the wall. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. "You're back," he rasped. "But you're not the same. What happened to me?" Gideon asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Gray pointed weakly to the clock. "It's consuming you. It's what it does. Pulls you into its web until you're no longer yourself." Gideon approached the workbench, his reflection shifting unnaturally in the clock's glass face. He could see the void behind his eyes, the faint shimmer of the mist clinging to his form. "We have to destroy it," Gideon said, gripping the hammer once more. Dr. Gray shook his head. "You tried that already. It's indestructible. As long as the shard remains bound to it, then how do we stop it?" Dr. Gray hesitated, glancing at the shadowed corners of the room. "There's a way, but it's dangerous. You'd have to unbind the shard from yourself." The air in the workshop grew colder as Dr. Gray explained. "The shard isn't just a piece of crystal. It's alive, a fragment of something ancient and malevolent. It's latched onto you because of your connection to Elias. If you can sever that connection, you might be able to banish it. But the process, it could kill you." Gideon tightened his grip on the hammer. "If I don't do it, this thing will destroy everything." Dr. Gray nodded grimly. "There's an altar beneath the workshop. Elias built it to perform the binding ritual. If we reverse the process, we might be able to weaken the shard enough to destroy it." The shadowed figure materialized again, its form towering and oppressive. "You're a fool to listen to him," it sneered. "The altar was built to honor me, to channel my power. Attempting to sever the connection will only unleash chaos." "Chaos is better than this," Gideon shot back. The figure's laughter rumbled like thunder. "Then let us see how far your defiance will take you." Dr. Gray led Gideon to a hidden trapdoor beneath the workshop's floorboards. The stairs descended into a narrow stone passage, the walls etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. As they walked, the ticking of the clocks grew louder, echoing through the corridor. "This place is a maze," Dr. Gray whispered. "Elias designed it to keep intruders out, and to keep whatever was down here contained." Gideon's unease deepened. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the passage itself were alive and watching them. Finally, they reached the chamber. At its center stood a massive stone altar, surrounded by gears and chains that hung from the ceiling like grotesque ornaments. The shard in Gideon's pocket burned hotter, as though it were resisting their presence. "We have to act quickly," Dr. Gray said, pulling a worn leather journal from his coat. He flipped through its pages, revealing sketches and notes scrawled in Elias's handwriting. "These symbols, they're the key. You'll need to carve them into the altar to start the ritual. Gideon hesitated, his hands trembling. And what happens to me? Dr. Gray met his gaze, his expression heavy with regret. You'll have to confront it. Whatever it shows you, whatever it does, you can't give in. Gideon etched the symbols into the altar, his every move accompanied by the ticking of invisible clocks. The shard pulsed furiously, its light spilling across the chamber like liquid fire. The air crackled with energy as the symbols began to glow, the altar vibrating beneath Gideon's hands. The shadowed figure appeared at the edge of the chamber, its form larger and more menacing than ever. You're making a mistake, it snarled. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Gideon ignored it, focusing on the final symbol. As he completed the carving, the altar erupted in a blinding flash of light, and the shard flew from his pocket, hovering above the stone. The figure let out a deafening roar, lunging toward Gideon. Gideon braced himself, but before the shadow could reach him, the light from the altar enveloped the entire chamber. For a moment, everything was silent. Then the light faded, revealing a horrifying sight. The shard had split, its fragments floating in the air like jagged pieces of a broken star. The shadowed figure writhed in agony, its form flickering and unstable. But Gideon's relief was short-lived. The fragments of the shard began to move, coalescing into a new shape, something far more terrifying than before. Dr. Gray's voice trembled as he whispered, "What have we done?" The newly formed entity opened its eyes, its gaze piercing through Gideon. "You've only just begun," it said, its voice layered with countless others. The ticking resumed, louder and more chaotic than ever, as the chamber began to collapse around them. The newly formed entity hovered above the altar, an amalgamation of shadow, light, and the shards of the crimson clock. Its shape was ever-changing, a grotesque mix of jagged edges and swirling mist, but its eyes, bright as molten gold, were fixed firmly on Gideon. "You cannot escape the cycle," it said, its voice a layered cacophony. "You've disturbed the order, and now you will pay the price." The chamber shook violently, gears grinding in the walls as if the entire underground structure were alive and angry. "Move!" Dr. Gray shouted, grabbing Gideon's arm and pulling him toward the passageway. Behind them, the altar cracked and split, releasing a blinding beam of red light that shot upward, tearing through the earth above. The clockmaker's workshop groaned in protest, the ground trembling as the destruction spread. "What did we release?" Gideon panted, his feet barely keeping up as they sprinted through the narrow corridor. Dr. Gray's face was pale, something far worse than the shard. "That entity, it's the core of what Elias tried to bind. A fragment of the eternal clock itself." They burst into the workshop, but the scene was unrecognizable. The once cozy room was now a chaotic mess, with shattered clocks and overturned furniture strewn about. The air felt heavy, each breath laced with the metallic tang of time gone awry. Outside, the red beam of light pierced the night sky, spiraling into the heavens. A low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. Gideon turned to Dr. Gray, his voice shaking. "How do we stop it? There has to be a way." Dr. Gray's hands trembled as he flipped through Elias's journal. "If there's a way, it's in here." But a deafening crash cut him off as the entity emerged from the trapdoor, its fragmented form weaving together into something more solid, more terrifying. It towered over them, its jagged edges casting twisted shadows across the walls. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said, its voice reverberating like the chime of 1,000 clocks striking midnight. Gideon's chest tightened as he stared into the entity's golden eyes. In them, he saw flashes of time unraveling, cities crumbling, oceans boiling, and people frozen in eternal agony. Dr. Gray shoved the journal into Gideon's hands. "Run. Find the answer in here. I'll hold it off." "No," Gideon protested, but Dr. Gray pushed him toward the door. "This is my penance," Gray said, his voice resolute. "Go." Reluctantly, Gideon stumbled out of the workshop, clutching the journal as the entity advanced on Dr. Gray. He hesitated at the threshold, hearing the older man's voice shout incantations, followed by the shriek of the entity's rage. Then silence. Gideon's heart sank, but he forced himself to keep moving. The journal was his only hope now. Outside, the town was eerily still. The streets were bathed in the crimson glow of the beam, and the ticking sound was everywhere, echoing off the buildings like a sinister symphony. As he ran, Gideon noticed the townsfolk frozen in place, their faces contorted in expressions of confusion and fear. They're caught in the loop, he realized, his stomach churning. The ticking grew louder as he reached the edge of town, where an old bell tower loomed against the blood-red sky. Inside the bell tower, Gideon collapsed onto the floor, flipping through the journal with trembling hands. The pages were filled with diagrams, spells, and cryptic notes, but one passage caught his eye. The eternal clock is not a mere device but a manifestation of time itself. To disrupt its flow is to risk annihilation. Only by confronting the core can the cycle be reset. Beneath the passage was a sketch of a strange device. A large, ornate clock with 12 gears surrounding a central crystal. This must be the reset mechanism, Gideon murmured. But where is it? He searched the pages for a clue and found a map scrawled in the margins. It marked a location deep in the woods outside town, labeled the Heart of Time. Gideon's pulse quickened. That's where I have to go. The woods were unnaturally quiet, the only sound the relentless ticking that seemed to follow Gideon wherever he went. The trees loomed tall and twisted, their branches intertwining to form an almost impenetrable canopy. As he followed the map, the air grew colder, and the light of the crimson beam filtered through the leaves, casting eerie patterns on the ground. Suddenly, a whispering sound surrounded him, faint at first but growing louder. Gideon? He froze, clutching the journal tightly. The voices were disembodied, coming from all around him. Gideon, turn back. He shook his head, forcing himself to move forward. It's just the entity playing tricks on me, he muttered, though his resolve wavered with every step. The path led to a clearing where a massive clock stood, its gears rusted and overgrown with vines. At its center was a faintly glowing crystal, the same crimson hue as the shard. This is it, Gideon said, approaching cautiously. As he reached for the crystal, the ticking grew deafening, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The entity materialized behind him, its form larger and more solid than ever. You dare tamper with the Heart of Time? It thundered. Gideon spun around, gripping the journal. I'll stop you, whatever it takes. The entity laughed, a sound that echoed like shattering glass. You are nothing but a pawn, Gideon. Do you truly believe you can defy the eternal clock? Gideon opened the journal to the incantation Dr. Gray had used, his voice steady despite his fear. By the gears that turn, by the time unbroken, I bind thee. Before he could finish, the entity lunged, its jagged form slicing through the air. Gideon dove aside, narrowly avoiding its attack. His heart pounded as he scrambled to his feet, clutching the journal like a lifeline. The crystal in the clock began to glow brighter, pulsing in rhythm with the ticking. The entity paused, its golden eyes narrowing. What have you done? It hissed. Gideon didn't respond. He focused on the journal, reciting the incantation again. The crystal's light intensified, and the entity let out a roar of fury. The ground cracked beneath them, and a blinding light enveloped the clearing. For a moment, everything was silent. Then Gideon heard a voice. A whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. You've started the reset, but will you survive it? The light consumed him, and the world dissolved into nothingness. When Gideon opened his eyes, the world around him was unrecognizable. He lay sprawled on cold, cracked stone, his body aching as though he had been torn apart and pieced back together. Above him, a blood-red sky churned with ominous clouds, the crimson light of the shattered beam casting grotesque shadows across the landscape. The air felt dense, pressing against his skin. The familiar ticking sound was gone, replaced by a deafening silence that seemed to hum with latent energy. Around him, the forest was twisted, its trees contorted into unnatural shapes. Time itself felt wrong. "Where am I?" Gideon muttered, his voice barely a whisper. The journal lay nearby, miraculously intact. He reached for it, his hands trembling. Flipping through its pages, he found new writing, words that hadn't been there before. "The reset has begun. The eternal clock awaits." The message sent a shiver down his spine. Gideon looked around, realizing the clearing he had been in was now a desolate wasteland. The massive clock that had once stood at the heart of the clearing was shattered, its gears scattered across the ground. But the crystal, the pulsing crimson heart, was gone. As he studied the journal, Gideon noticed that more of its pages had become legible, revealing cryptic diagrams and instructions. One passage caught his attention. "The eternal clock is fragmented. To repair it is to restore balance. To fail is to doom all existence." Below the text was an illustration of 6 glowing shards, each resembling the crystal he had seen, scattered across various landscapes. A frozen tundra, a raging volcano, a vast desert, and others. Beside the image was a simple instruction: reclaim the shards. Reforge the clock. Gideon's chest tightened. Reforge the clock? How am I supposed to do that? His question was met with silence, but the faint glow of the journal's pages seemed to guide his gaze toward a distant mountain range. One peak glimmered faintly with red light, the same hue as the crystal. "That has to be it," he murmured, clutching the journal. The first shard. The trek toward the mountains was grueling. The landscape shifted unpredictably. Fields of cracked earth gave way to forests where the trees whispered unintelligibly, and rivers flowed backward, their surfaces shimmering like molten silver. The unnatural silence pressed on Gideon's mind, making every step feel heavier. He clung to the journal like a lifeline, its glowing pages occasionally revealing cryptic hints. At one point, it directed him to avoid a shadowy ravine where ghostly figures writhed, their faces frozen in eternal screams. Another time, it warned of a bridge that collapsed moments after he crossed it. As he climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew colder, each breath stinging his lungs. Snow began to fall, but even the flakes seemed unnatural, each one a perfect geometric pattern, glowing faintly before melting into the ground. Finally, he reached a plateau where a strange structure stood, a tall, spiraling tower of ice and steel. The shard's crimson light pulsed faintly at its peak, visible through the translucent walls. Gideon approached cautiously, the tower looming above him like a frozen monolith. Its entrance was a massive arched doorway, adorned with intricate carvings of clocks and gears. As he stepped inside, the air grew colder, and the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang. The interior was a labyrinth of icy corridors, each one echoing with the faint sound of ticking. The walls were lined with frozen statues, figures frozen in mid-motion, their expressions twisted in fear or pain. Gideon shuddered, avoiding their glassy stares. The journal glowed again, revealing a new passage. The shard test's resolve. "Time bends to those who endure." Gideon's heart sank. He had no idea what that meant, but he had no choice but to move forward. The corridor led to a massive chamber where a clock face was embedded in the floor, its hands spinning wildly. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it, the crimson shard pulsed faintly. As he stepped toward it, the room shifted. The walls dissolved into darkness, and Gideon found himself standing in a place that felt both familiar and alien. Around him, fragments of his memories played out. His childhood home, the workshop, moments of joy and sorrow, blurring together like a surreal tapestry. A voice echoed through the void, deep and resonant. "Time defines all. Face it or be lost within it." Suddenly, figures emerged from the shadows, versions of himself at different points in his life. A younger Gideon, wide-eyed and innocent, stepped forward, clutching a wooden toy clock. An older version followed, his face lined with regret and sorrow. The younger Gideon spoke, his voice trembling. "Why did you let it all fall apart? You could have stopped this." The older version sneered. "You're a coward, always running from responsibility. You'll fail this too." Gideon's chest tightened. I didn't choose this," he shouted. I'm trying to fix it. The figures closed in, their voices growing louder, accusing him, mocking him. The void seemed to press in on him, threatening to swallow him whole. Gideon fell to his knees, clutching the journal. No, he whispered, his voice growing stronger. I won't let time control me. Control it. The journal glowed brighter, and the void began to crack, shards of light breaking through the darkness. The voices faded, replaced by the sound of ticking, steady, rhythmic, comforting. When Gideon opened his eyes, he was back in the chamber. The clock face beneath him was still, its hands frozen at midnight. The pedestal and the shard waited, undisturbed. He rose to his feet, his resolve stronger than ever. Stepping forward, he reached for the shard. The moment his fingers touched it, a surge of energy coursed through him. Images flooded his mind, visions of the eternal clock, the other shards, and the entity watching him from the shadows. As the visions faded, the shard's light dimmed, settling into a steady glow. The journal revealed another message. One shard claimed, 5 remain. The cycle can still be mended. As Gideon exited the tower, the air felt heavier, the sky darker. The crimson beam in the distance had split, its tendrils snaking across the horizon like cracks in a mirror. The entity's voice echoed faintly in his mind. You delay the inevitable. The clock will strike for you, too. Gideon tightened his grip on the shard, his jaw set. We'll see about that. He turned toward the next marked location on the journal's map, a desert where the sands glowed under a perpetual twilight. The journey was far from over, but his determination burned brighter than ever. Gideon stood at the edge of a sprawling desert, the horizon shimmering with heat. The last shard glowed faintly in the distance, its golden red light piercing the twilight. He gripped the journal tightly, now battered and stained, but still his guide. The entries had grown increasingly erratic, the ink seeming to bleed through the pages, but one phrase remained clear. All shards must converge. Only then can time be restored. His journey had cost him dearly. His sanity stretched thin, his body battered by trials that had tested the limits of human endurance. The world around him was unraveling. The sky was fractured, split into disjointed fragments of day and night, while time itself faltered, moments stuttering or rushing past unnaturally. The eternal clock waited, its towering silhouette barely visible in the distance. Every step Gideon took toward the shard was heavier, as though the world resisted his progress. He could feel the entity watching, its presence like a shadow pressing on his mind. Just one more, he muttered, clenching his fists. Then it ends. The final shard was housed within an ancient temple, half buried in the sands. Its architecture was unlike anything Gideon had seen before, walls etched with shifting glyphs that seemed to rewrite themselves as he approached. The air inside was stifling, heavy with the weight of centuries. The shard sat atop a pedestal at the temple's heart, its light pulsating in sync with Gideon's heartbeat. As he reached for it, the room shifted. The walls dissolved into an endless expanse of mirrors, each reflecting a version of him. Some young and hopeful, others broken and weary. One reflection was not his own. The shadowy figure of the entity loomed behind him, its form rippling like smoke. You think you can fix this? The entity's voice was a low growl, reverberating through the mirrored chamber. You are but a cog in the machine, Gideon. Replaceable. Disposable. Gideon ignored the taunts, focusing on the shard. As his fingers closed around it, the mirrors shattered, shards raining down in a cascade of light. The shard's energy surged through him, and he felt the final piece of the puzzle click into place. The journey to the eternal clock was a blur, the world distorting around him as the shard's combined power bent time and space. When Gideon arrived, the clock was more imposing than ever. Its massive gears grinding sluggishly, the hands frozen just before midnight. The structure seemed alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy. The journal's final instruction burned into his mind. Place the shards. Complete the cycle. He ascended the staircase that spiraled around the clock's towering form, the shards glowing brighter with each step. At the summit, a circular platform waited, grooves carved into its surface to fit the shards. One by one, Gideon placed them. Each shard clicked into place with a resonant hum, and the clock shuddered as though awakening from a deep slumber. When the final shard was set, the clock's hands began to move, the grinding of its gears growing louder. But before he could step back, the entity emerged. The shadowy figure coalesced in front of him, its form towering and amorphous, eyes like burning coals. You think you've won, but you don't understand. The clock doesn't bring salvation. It brings judgment. Gideon stood his ground, the journal clutched in one hand. You've been trying to stop me from fixing this. Why? What are you afraid of? The entity laughed, a sound like cracking glass. Afraid? Foolish mortal. The eternal clock binds everything. Life, death, time itself. Do you think you can wield its power without consequence? You will destroy yourself. Maybe, Gideon said, stepping toward the clock. But I'd rather risk it than let you keep twisting everything. The entity lunged, its shadowy tendrils reaching for him. Gideon reacted instinctively, holding up the journal. The shards embedded in the clock flared with light, and the tendrils recoiled, the entity screaming in rage. With a final surge of determination, Gideon reached for the clock's central mechanism, a glowing orb suspended above the gears. As his hand touched it, a blinding light erupted, engulfing him and the entity. Time itself seemed to freeze, the world around him dissolving into a void of white. He saw flashes of the past, present, and future, moments of joy and sorrow, lives intertwined in a complex web. He saw himself both as he was and as he could have been, and he saw the entity, a being born of chaos, seeking to exploit the clock's power for its own ends. A voice echoed in his mind. Not the entities, but something ancient and serene. Balance must be restored. Sacrifices must be made. Gideon nodded, understanding what was required. He closed his eyes and let go, pouring his essence into the clock. The gears began to turn, faster and faster, the hands racing toward midnight. When Gideon opened his eyes, he was back in the forest clearing where his journey had begun. The eternal clock stood whole and silent, its gears no longer grinding. The sky was clear, the fractured light replaced by a serene dusk. But Gideon was no longer the same. He felt hollow, as though a part of him had been left behind in the clock. The journal was gone, and so were the shards. The entity's presence had vanished, leaving only a faint echo in his mind. As he walked away from the clearing, he realized the world felt right. Time flowed naturally, the oppressive weight lifted. But he knew he had paid a price. His own time felt limited, his body frail. Weeks later, the townsfolk spoke of a mysterious man who had appeared in their village, warning them of the eternal clock's dangers before disappearing without a trace. They never saw him again, but rumors spread of an old clockmaker who had once dabbled in forces beyond comprehension. And in the heart of the forest, the eternal clock stood as a silent sentinel, its purpose fulfilled but its power undiminished. It waited, timeless and eternal, for the next soul brave or foolish enough to seek it out.